Hello everyone. I hope you're having a really good day today. In this video, we're going to explore a quiet but powerful story about love, trust, and the fragile warmth two people build together in the middle of a harsh winter. When a simple farm, a child's smile, and a father's hidden secret begin to test everything they believe in. If you enjoy this kind of heartfelt, real-life storytelling, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next video. The cold cut through the old wooden house as if it had a mind of its own, slipping in through every tiny crack and seam. The temperature hovered just above 10 degrees Celsius, cold enough that even the walls seemed to shiver. By the small, crackling fire, a tiny creature named Me was curled tightly in James's arms, its body pressed against his chest as if it instinctively knew where the warmth lived. James sat still, one hand gently stroking its back, his voice low and calm, almost like he was talking to a child. "Your name is Me, right?" he murmured softly. "Where did Diep bring you from, The flames danced in front of him, their orange glow flickering across his face, but his eyes kept drifting toward the yard outside. A thin layer of mist clung to the ground, blurring the fence and the gate beyond it. Diep had left earlier that morning to buy groceries, and the image of her walking alone through the cold stayed with him. The wind slipped through the gaps in the door, carrying with it a sharp chill and a quiet sense of unease. He wondered if she had come back yet, if the cold was biting into her hands, if she was rushing just a little faster because of it. James reached over and added another piece of firewood, carefully adjusting it so the flames would catch properly. He tended the fire the way someone protects something precious, as if keeping it alive meant holding on to a part of himself. Me nudged its head against his hand, letting out a soft sound that felt like comfort without words. In that moment, waiting turned into something heavier than simple anticipation. It wasn't just about Diep coming home. It was about how empty the space felt without her. James exhaled slowly, his breath turning into pale mist in the cold air. He knew she would be back. He always did. But sitting there alone, with only Me and the sound of burning wood, made him painfully aware of how fragile even the simplest happiness could be. The cold outside was nothing compared to the quiet loneliness creeping into his chest. Still, a small smile touched his lips as he scratched Me behind the ears, his ears tuned to the faintest sound of footsteps at the gate. The fire popped softly, almost like a promise. Warmth was still here. It hadn't disappeared. It was just waiting. The door creaked open, letting in a sharp gust of cold air along with Diep's silhouette. She stepped inside with bags in both hands, feathers sticking out at odd angles, her cheeks flushed from the cold. James looked up instantly, his eyes lighting up the way flames do when fresh wood is added. She set the bags down and smiled, her voice gentle but tired. "It's really cold today. I bought some feathers to make a drinking trough for the chickens later." James stood and handed her a roasted sweet potato he had been keeping warm by the fire. "Eat this." Diep took it with both hands, steam rising between her fingers. She took a bite, and the warmth seemed to spread immediately, from her palms to her chest, easing the tightness left behind by the cold. They sat down by the hearth together, close enough that their shoulders brushed. Their conversation drifted naturally to the farm. The oversized coop sat almost empty, holding only 20 chickens, and it looked more pitiful than promising. Diep mentioned it with a quiet sigh, and James nodded, already thinking ahead. Then without hesitation, he said, "I'm not going to work today. I'll stay here and work with you." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Diep looked at him, surprised, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. That one sentence felt like a promise, tightening an invisible thread between them. They talked about buying ducks and geese, about digging small ponds, about slowly expanding the flock. Their laughter mixed with the crackling of firewood, filling the small house with sound and warmth. Diep glanced at James and saw more than plans in his eyes. She saw hope for a shared place, a future shaped by both their hands. The cold outside seemed to retreat, pushed back by the warmth they created together. James reached for her hand, holding it gently, as if afraid that too much pressure might break the moment. They sat there shoulder to shoulder, smoke curling upward, the scent of roasted sweet potato lingering in the air. There were no grand promises, no dramatic words, just actions, glances, and a shared silence that said enough. No matter how cold the world outside became, this was where they belonged. For a while, the fire burned steadily. Then the mood shifted, growing heavier. Diep stared into the glowing embers, her voice trembling just slightly as she spoke. "Your father took Nye out to play today, without telling anyone. At first I was so scared. We couldn't find her anywhere. I kept thinking something bad had happened." James listened quietly, his grip on her hand tightening just a little, as if passing calm through his fingers. He understood that fear, the sudden panic of imagining loss in a single unguarded moment. Diep paused, then continued, her tone softening. "But when I saw Nye, she was happy. He really cared for her." James let out a slow breath and gave a faint smile, his gaze drifting somewhere far away. "My dad is strict," he said, "but he really loves children." Those words felt like a small crack in a solid wall. They leaned closer, shoulders touching, sharing a fragile hope that Nye might soften his father's heart, that acceptance could come quietly, without force. The cold still lingered in the air, but something warmer spread between them, understanding. James looked at Diep and saw not just the worry that had faded, but a new belief forming. Fear had turned into strength, anxiety into quiet hope. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the soft pops of burning wood, their breathing slowly sinking. "I just hope next time he tells us first," James whispered, "so you don't have to worry like that again." Diep nodded, squeezing his hand. In the heart of winter, they had carved out a small, warm corner, built on trust and patience. Later that morning, pale sunlight filtered through the mist, settling on the rocky ground outside. James grabbed the shovel, while Diep stood beside him, and together they began digging a hole for the drinking trough. The soil fought back immediately, roots tangled around the blade, sharp stones refusing to budge. Each push drew a quiet sigh, sweat forming on their foreheads despite the cold. "The soil here is so rocky, sir," Diep said, her voice tired but steady. James nodded and adjusted his grip, using brute strength to shift the stones aside. They worked in rhythm. He dug. She arranged the rocks, her calling him sir again and again, the word becoming a private rhythm between them. Every stone was placed carefully, as if they were building something far more important than a simple trough. James's hands began to bleed from the sharp edges, but he didn't stop. Diep watched him, emotions twisting in her chest. Concern, pride, tenderness. They paused to check the depth, adjusting until it felt right. "This should be good enough," James said, wiping his brow. Diep nodded, her fingers brushing his in silent thanks. The work was exhausting, but standing side by side, the cold and stones felt less powerful than their shared effort. Each strike of the shovel cut into more than soil. It tested their resolve and strengthened it. They kept going, wrapped in meaningful silence, two people quietly building a small world together. By the time the sun climbed higher, its light felt pale and distant, offering brightness without warmth. The cold still clung stubbornly to the ground, seeping through the soles of their shoes. James and Diep stood beside the freshly dug hole, their hands coated in dirt, small cuts visible where sharp stones had bitten into skin. They took a brief breath, then moved on to the next step, stacking the second layer of stones with careful precision. "We have to build it higher," James said quietly, his eyes scanning the fluffy chicks huddled nearby. "If it's too low, they might fall in. They'll get wet, get cold. They could die." His voice dropped at the last words. Diep nodded without hesitation, selecting the largest, flattest stones and placing them one by one. Each stone felt heavier than it looked, not just in weight, but in meaning. This wasn't just about a drinking trough. It was about protecting small, fragile lives in a world that didn't wait for anyone to grow stronger. They worked slowly, checking the height again and again. James pulled the hose closer, the sound of water rushing through it, breaking the silence. He held it steady, while Diep used a bucket to guide the overflow. Their movements smooth and instinctive, like they'd been working together for years. The basin began to fill, the water catching the dull gray of the winter sky and reflecting it back. They stopped once more to inspect the stones. High enough, safe enough. In that moment, watching the water rise, a quiet anxiety surfaced. This simple structure held more than water. It carried their effort, their care, their shared responsibility. James looked at Diep and noticed the sweat tracing a line down her cheek, her hair slightly damp at the temples. Something warm surged through him. Gratitude, tenderness, and a hope so strong it almost hurt. Hope that all this work meant something, that it would last. Diep straightened up and gave a tired smile. "It's done, sir." They stood side by side, staring at the still pool. In the heart of winter, they had created a small haven, not only for the chicks, but for themselves. A place shaped by patience and quiet determination. As midday approached, shadows stretched softly across the yard, dulling the cold just enough to make it bearable. Inside the house, an elderly figure slept deeply, unaware of the steady rhythm of work and worry unfolding outside. Diep moved into the kitchen, the sound of boiling water soon filling the space. The rich aroma of cooking noodles spread through the air, wrapping the room in comfort. James sat at the table, watching her without saying a word. There was something grounding about the way she moved. Calm, familiar, steady. When she carried out 2 steaming bowls and set them down on the worn wooden table, she smiled lightly. "Let's eat. It's lunchtime." They sat across from each other, the sound of slurping noodles mixing with quiet laughter. Steam rose between them, fogging the air and softening everything around them. James took a bite, then looked up and said simply, "You cook really well." Diep smiled, then began telling him a story. It was about a girl from a poor, rural village who shared her struggles online. her failures, her long days, her tired nights. Over time, she built something of her own and eventually became successful selling noodles. Diep's voice was slow and steady, almost thoughtful, as if she were speaking about more than just someone else's life. James listened closely, his eyes brightening. "That's a really good story," he said, "and your cooking keeps getting better." They joked about eating noodles every day. Wouldn't it get boring? James laughed and shrugged. "If you cook it, I can eat it forever." The words were casual, but they carried something deeper, a promise hidden in plain sight. The meal was simple, but it filled more than their stomachs. Between the steam, the sunlight filtering through the window, and the story of perseverance, they shared dreams without naming them. The cold outside lingered, but inside, warmth settled in quietly, easing the fatigue in their bones. They ate slowly, savoring each bite, as if tasting a future that was still forming. In the afternoon, the light began to fade, and the cold crept back in. James stood up, his expression shifting. "I have to pick up Nye soon," he said softly. "And there's an important matter this afternoon." Diep nodded. Her smile was gentle, but it couldn't hide the reluctance tugging at her heart. As if sensing it, James added, "Don't overthink what happened earlier. Dad really likes children. It's normal." The reassurance felt thin, like a fragile layer of ice over deeper worry, but Diep didn't argue. James thanked her for the meal, for the work, for the day. He changed his clothes, then stepped out of the house, his movements quick but heavy, as if part of him didn't want to leave. The scene shifted. In a larger, colder house, James's father sat with his phone pressed to his ear. His voice was sharp, efficient, as he arranged a car for a 3-day business trip. His expression remained unreadable, his thoughts carefully guarded. Quietly, without telling Diep, he had been supporting her company. He feared that if she knew, she would only see him as the villain pulling strings from the shadows. Nearby, James's mother stirred awake, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Why do you keep forbidding James and Diep?" she asked. "You even played with Nye. I thought you had accepted it." He didn't answer. His silence stretched, heavy and deliberate. After 25 years of marriage, she knew that silence meant something was being hidden. "Is there something you can't tell me?" she pressed. "Just say it." He finally spoke, his tone firm but distant. "I'll tell you when I get back." The promise hung in the air, unresolved, casting a shadow over the room. It stood in stark contrast to the simple warmth James and Diep had shared earlier that day. As evening approached, Diep stayed behind at the farm, selling the last 2 kilos of goods. Before James left, she reminded him softly, "Stir-fry beans for Nye tonight, okay?" James nodded and drove away, the road stretching long and quiet ahead of him. Diep stood still, watching until his car disappeared into the distance. Her heart was full of hope, of gratitude, but unease curled quietly beneath it all. Between the calm of the farm and the unspoken pressure of the larger family, a crack had begun to form, small, almost invisible, but growing. Somewhere, a secret waited to surface. And when it did, it threatened to break into the fragile world they had only just begun to build.